And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Chris Heath is the author of No Road Leading Back, An Improbable Escape from the Nazis, and the Tangled Way We Tell the Stories of the Holocaust. He is an award-winning journalist and author and has written about a wide array of subjects for GQ, The Atlantic, Esquire New York, and Vanity Fair. Elizabeth White is the author of The Counterfeit Countess, the Jewish woman who rescued thousands of Poles during the Holocaust. She recently retired from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she served as historian and as research director for the museum's Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Jack Fairweather is the author of The Prosecutor, One Man's Battle to Bring Nazis to Justice. He served as a correspondent for the Washington Post and the Daily Telegraph, where he was the paper's Baghdad and Persian Gulf bureau chief. Debórah Dwork is the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Pathbreaking in her early oral recording of Holocaust child survivors, Dwork weaves their narratives into the history she writes. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand things over to our speakers.
So my name is... It was working?
Yeah, just put it closer to your mouth.
Actually, do you need me to use the microphone at all?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Debórah Dwork, and we're off to a rough start because I thought it was my job to introduce the speakers, but they've already been introduced. So that leaves more time for them to speak, which is a good thing in the end. The one thing I would say is that this is a star-studded panel. Every single one a prize-winning author or the co-author of a prize-winning author. So it is my pleasure and my honor to serve as the chair and moderator of this panel. We will go in alphabetical order by surname, which means, Jack,
Oh gosh.
you're on and you're up. Let me just tell you the rules of the road. The rules of the road are that each presenter has up to 7 minutes to talk. And then you have the opportunity to ask questions of each in turn, which will give us enough time at the end to consider all 3 books at once. Are you with me? Are you with Jack? And off we go.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for the introduction. And I've had to write out what I wanted to say because I always, when speaking in a timed event, I just can't do it in a comfortable manner. So excuse me from reading aloud. It's also the case that I haven't actually had a chance to speak about my book because it's literally going to the printers tomorrow. It's published in February, and we're just doing the last tweaks this morning. Anyway, better not waste any of more of my time. The prosecutor. Oh, yes.
No, I was just saying TikTok.
TikTok, yes, exactly. The Prosecutor begins by asking readers to imagine a history of the 20th century in which the Holocaust is only a footnote to the Second World War, where the encyclopedia entry for Auschwitz describes the flourishing chemicals industry in the nearby town, but omits the story of the gas chambers, where school textbooks describe Hitler as, quote, gifted in a variety of ways, and concludes that, quote, no more than 100 people knew about it. This isn't an abstract thought experiment. This was West Germany in the years following Hitler's defeat, when the Holocaust was all but forgotten and the Allies sanctioned the return of millions of former Nazis to forge a new country to serve as a bulwark against communism. It was, in the words of West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer in 1949, time to let bygones be bygones. And this is the world into which Fritz Bauer, the subject of my new book, returns that same year. I'd like you all to picture a scene with me. It's Bauer on a train entering Germany at the Danish border in April 1949. He's 45 years old, a small man in a neatly tailored suit with a careworn look. He was once the youngest judge in Germany and a rising progressive voice in the Weimar Republic. He's also gay, Jewish, and a committed socialist. The Nazis threw him in prison, and he was very lucky, as you can understand, to escape with his life. And now he's heading back to Germany after 12 years of exile to take up a job as Attorney General excuse me, in the small city of Braunschweig. It's a modest position. He'll run an office of a dozen prosecutors as the German justice system reestablishes itself amid the rubble. What Bauer doesn't say to the border guard who asks for his papers, or to anyone else in fact, is the deeper reason he's returning. Bauer has got a radical idea that he already knows is going to set him against the country he's returning to. He's watched the Allies impose their vision of justice on Germany, and he knows that it's not gone far enough. Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, declared in 1945 that only Hitler and his inner circle should be considered responsible for the Nazis' crimes. 22 people were convicted the following year, and a few thousand more in follow-up trials and through denazification proceedings. The Allies believed that justice had been served. Their attention is shifting to the Cold War. But Bauer knows this is not the case because Hitler had enlisted the entire German people in a national effort to persecute, plunder, and finally kill the entirety of Europe's Jews. 8.5 million Germans had joined the Nazi Party. 250,000 had served in the SS that operated death camps like Auschwitz. Hundreds of thousands had participated in the vast bureaucratic machinery of industrialized murder. And yet most of these people have simply slipped back into German society and resumed their lives as if nothing had happened. Bauer's idea, his incomplete, seemingly impossible, crazy idea, was to use the justice system to force a national reckoning. He wanted to prosecute Nazis in the courts, to hold their crimes up to security, expose the roots of Nazism in German culture, and if possible, expunge them. What were the chances of Bauer ever achieving that? Well, Adenauer had appointed as his chief of staff one of the leading implementers of the Nuremberg race laws. The CIA is backing a network of compromised officers and ex-SS men who are determined to keep the past silent. And the justice system itself is stacked with former Nazis, including his own office, where one of his prosecutors helped run the city's euthanasia program, which was responsible for 15,000 deaths. Even if Bauer succeeded in bringing cases to court, were his fellow Germans prepared to listen to him, of all people, a gay Jewish camp survivor? Any one of those identities might incite his fellow countrymen to ostracize him or vilify him or worse. So we often take for granted our knowledge of the Holocaust, as it's commemorated each year, taught in schools and universities, told in books and films. But to sit on the train with Bauer in 1949 is to realize a different, terrifying future was possible. I think in a time when our shared sense of values are under threat, Bauer's story is a reminder that history is never settled, and each generation must struggle with the meaning of the Holocaust. I first came across Bauer's story while writing my last book, The Volunteer, about Witold Pilecki, a Polish resistance fighter who infiltrated Auschwitz to become the first to inform the Allies about the camp's horrors. His story forces us to consider why the world looked away from the mass murder of Europe's Jews. But I was struck while looking into what happened to the perpetrators of Auschwitz to discover that most escaped justice for almost 2 decades after the war. And it's into that dark, disorienting gap that Bauer's story plunges us. What sort of battles did Bauer have to wage to overcome the forces of the West German state? How did he persuade people to recognize their own intolerance and prejudice? How did he change a culture that was in denial about its past? I spent the past 5 years writing a book about Bauer that's due to be published next year in February with Penguin Random House, entitled The Prosecutor. My last book, The Volunteer, sold 500,000 copies and has been translated into 26 languages. The Prosecutor is the history of the Cold War struggle to establish the Holocaust in our collective conscience. It's also the story of one extraordinary brave man who bent the arc of history towards justice. My book is out in February, and I suppose I must plug it and ask you if, although I don't have a book for you to sign, if you would like to support me sharing Bauer's story, if you could pre-order it, I would be very grateful. I will be signing The Volunteer, my previous book, at the author's table. Thank you very much.
So, questions for Jack? There have been several films about Bauer. Has your other book, The Volunteer, is it potentially going to be some kind of film?
There's a production company that's made a script and are making it into a film, so but it does take a while.
Good to hear. Question? Yes. Yes, please. Yes.
What drew you, okay, then to the story of the volunteer?
Could you speak a little more, a little louder?
What drew you initially to this area, this topic, in general?
What brought me to this topic in the first place? That's a really good question. Really by chance, in many ways. I was a war reporter in Iraq and Afghanistan for 10 years, and I happened to meet up with a war reporter friend of mine after we both left the war zone, and he had just come back from a reporting trip to Auschwitz, and he said, "Oh, it's the strangest thing. I just read about, it was a small exhibit about this resistance cell in Auschwitz," and that idea was just such a shock to me. I mean, I think we all think of Auschwitz as this sort of place of absolute suffering and death, and the idea that anyone or any group of people could stand up to the forces of evil in a place like that was what led me then on the journey towards discovering Pilecki's story. Amazingly, his report, an amazing piece of writing, had never been translated into English, and it wasn't until a few years later that I read a review by Timothy Schneider about that report, and yes, put the two pieces together and realized here was an amazing story to be told.
The woman at the rear first, and then you, ma'am.
Thank you. So, could you talk about your research for the prosecutor? I assume that I'm assuming that it wasn't all in Germany and German documents, and how you went about it, and how you tracked the progression of what happened, and whether you went I'm a lawyer, so I'm really interested in whether you went into the German court system in terms of the files, and et cetera. Thank you.
So the question was how I approached, in a research way, the story, and I think I like to tell narrative non-fiction, which is another way of saying I like to tell history as a story, because I think that's the best way to connect it with people. At the same time, that puts incredible amount of research strain on me and the researchers I work with, because basically every single detail has to be from a source, and some of the places I turned to initially, of course, was Bauer's own writing. He wrote a lot of journalism about his ideas. I tracked down his family and friends in the places he lived, from Germany, Denmark, and Sweden, and had some of those delightful moments of any biographer where you meet up with a family and they say, "Oh, well, I do have a box of letters upstairs in the attic. Let me just grab them." And there are 20 letters by Bauer to that said family, which have never been sort of seen before in a sort of historical perspective. And there are, of course, this being Germany, vast archival documents. I mean, Bauer put together what was at the time the biggest trial in West Germany, possibly still is, a vast trove of documents, and I was very lucky to work with a couple of really talented researchers who together we were able to process this material. So that is everything from those very first interrogation protocols with both perpetrators and witnesses, through to the sort of notes of the prosecutors as they're building their case, through to the trial transcripts as much as they exist, and then all of the press coverage for some of these trials. And it's incredibly, sometimes incredibly dull work, but then, because you can imagine legalese from a storyteller's perspective can be difficult, but what was always embedded in those documents, which was just so amazing for me, and one of the, the powerful things about Bauer's story is here we have survivors for the first time telling their stories in many cases, and of course it's done in this sort of legal way, but just hearing them speak, knowing that Bauer was giving them this platform to share their stories, incredibly powerful. And in addition to doing that archival research, I also tracked down a lot of those witness families to hear their stories, hear what it meant for them to testify in Frankfurt, in particular, in the Auschwitz trial. So the result, long answer to your question,
Stop you there.
yes, is a lot of research.
I did call on you.
I'll
So
give up my time.
thank you. Thank you very much. If you can hold the question till the end. Chris.
Hi. Hi, everyone. In June 2016, news of a discovery went around the world. This is how the story about it in the New York Times, which is where I learned about it, began. A team of archaeologists and mapmakers say they have uncovered a forgotten tunnel that 80 Jews dug largely by hand as they tried to escape from a Nazi extermination site in Lithuania about 70 years ago. The extermination site in question was Ponar, or Panari or Panarai, a few miles from the center of Lithuania's capital, Vilna or Vilnius, for centuries a center of European Jewish culture. People here may be well aware, at least in general terms, of what happened at Ponar. When the Germans invaded Eastern Europe in June 1941 and began the systematic large-scale killing of Jewish populations for the first time, they often looked for places which suited their horrific needs. At Ponar, the Russians, the previous occupiers, had been halfway through digging an airport fuel depot, and when they fled, they left a series of large empty pits in a quiet forest, offering the Germans a hideous convenience. Over the following months, the Germans took at least 70,000 people there, predominantly Vilna's Jewish population, and shot them, filling these pits with their bodies. A couple of years later, in late 1943, there was a move by the Germans, here and at other similar sites, to erase the most obvious evidence of what had been done. To this end, that's when the 80 Jews were brought here. One of the original Russian pits, which had vertical stone sides dug deep into the ground, hadn't been used for the killings and was empty. These Jews were now told to make their living quarters in the bottom of that pit. That's where they spent their nights. Then, each day, ladders were lowered down for them to come up, and they would be forced to spend their days disinterring the bodies from the other pits, heaping what they dug up into huge pyres and burning them. Despite transparently and sincere promises from the Germans that they would be allowed to live good lives once they'd finished their labor, they well realized that they were now maybe the best living witnesses of all to what had happened here, and that inevitably the final evidence that would need to be eradicated would be them. So they thought of escape, and absent any other more plausible options, they considered digging a tunnel. But it seemed impossible. For one thing, they would have to start by digging downwards, so that they could get underneath the pit's stone walls. For another, how would they hide what they were doing? They solved the second problem by building a wooden pantry in plain sight in the middle of the pit, but with a false back wall on which they hung their most disgusting and louse-infested clothes to discourage closer scrutiny. In the cavity behind the false wall, they dug down. For tools, they did start out using their hands and also spoons. As you might imagine, they faced a multitude of other hurdles along the way, some overcome with ingenuity and imagination, others with sheer endurance. But improbably, the tunnel progressed. Over several months, they dug around 30 meters, far enough past the sentries guarding the pit's circumference that if they tried to make a break for it at night, they hoped they might get away. On April 15th, 1944, they did try. Even though the escape was discovered as it was taking place, 12 people are known to have successfully got away. It was the geophysical path of this tunnel that the 2016 research team appeared to have found. That's what I thought I was going to write a book about. It would be the story of what Ponar was and what had happened there. It would be the story of the escape and of the men who had escaped, and of whatever I could discover about their lives afterward. And I did write that book. All of the 12 known escapees are long dead, but I tracked down at least partial accounts from 9 of them, met with as many of their families as I could, mostly in Israel, and spent time in Lithuania, Ponar and elsewhere, uncovering all I was able. But in the end, all of that would only be one part of my book, No Road Leading Back. Let me try to explain. There were several early accounts written of what had taken place at Ponar in the months after liberation, mostly in the Lithuanian press. And it's sobering to read them now, for they almost all include some kind of confident invocation along the lines of, now all the world will know what took place here and will never forget. But that's not really what happened. That 70,000 or more Jews died here has, since the end of the war, never been a secret. But it's a story that has, more often than not, slipped by more or less unnoticed in the pages of wider history. When it has surfaced, its details have often been misremembered or mangled or misunderstood, or at times even deliberately misused. As I started to write the book I thought I was going to write, I realized that I couldn't properly tell this first story in an honest and rigorous way about what happened at Ponar, and about not just what we do know, but what we do not, without also showing the often surprising, sometimes maddening, and sometimes heartbreaking ways that parts of this story have and haven't emerged over the years. This second narrative didn't only seem just as important, more and more it seemed an absolutely essential part of the first story. The book I finally wrote was the best way I could find to tell and honor the story of Ponar and those who were there. But I think it also became a book about how vulnerable history often becomes in its telling.
Thank you. Questions for Chris? Sir.
Could you speak a little more broadly about which parts of the Holocaust you think are, better known and which are lesser known?
Auschwitz. You want to tell us the prompt for the question?
Well, yeah, the part of the book about how the Ponar, how this
Well-
history is not well known.
I think, the fact that there must be hundreds of thousands of books. Would that be a fair?
Yes.
Not many about this, not even just about Ponar, but actually not many about this period of history, relatively speaking, before, let me put it, it's too general a question to answer in total, but, one thing that definitely I think has happened in the popular imagination, maybe in the late 20th century, is that one Holocaust experience, which maybe typically would be the experience of the gas chambers in places like Auschwitz, that multiplied by 6 million times, came to resemble the Holocaust. And that was an incredibly important thing for people to, on one level, understand. But on the other hand, there's all kinds of other stories that got kind of pushed away. I mean, another reason why, it's not really answering this question, but one of the many reasons why I think a story like this, which seems incredible that people don't know about better, isn't known about better, is there's simply too many stories, which is a horrendous sentence to say, but there are so many, there are a lot more stories like this that haven't been properly written about.
Other questions? Yes. Yes, sir. And then after that, there's a woman behind. Go ahead, sir.
Are there many Lithuanian collaborators that were complicit in these
Yes, the simple answer is yes. They're about Lithuanian collaborators and whether they existed. A lot of the actual shooting at Ponar was done by Lithuanians. It's, you know, it's something I go into in quite a lot of detail in the book. It's the history of what happened during the war is not at all straightforward. It's certainly not. You know, that doesn't mean that every Lithuanian was participating in something like this, and then of course there's a complicated history going forward in Lithuania and other places in Eastern Europe about the very difficult path to acknowledging exactly what role people played in it. And again, in Lithuania, that's a very you know, it's like a lot of the best research about what really happened at Pona has been done by Lithuanians. You know, so to suggest that there's some kind of blanket ignoring of this history or denial of this history is not fair at all. On the other hand, there are kind of lots of very complicated and sometimes troubling cross-currents.
Yeah, I was going to comment on.
Could you speak a little louder?
I was just going to comment on what you just said about the one Chinese Lithuanian on-Jews collaborators with the Germans.
Okay. She was going to ask about Lithuanian collaborators.
Yeah.
It's been hidden, and it's not even in denial, it's just been hidden.
Sorry, I can't hear.
No, it's been hidden, the history.
I think it's been alternately and continue a mixture between hidden and revealed. You know, so it's certainly worth looking. You know, you know, to look at it closely. It's very important, but I'm very reluctant to say it's all one thing or the other.
Sir.
I think it's probably fair to say that the Germans were not the only ones who were perpetrating the Holocaust. There were plenty of collaborators in practically every country, some more, some less, but in some cases the locals were worse than the Germans.
Going to your book.
Yeah, there's a few more people who had arms raised. If we,
Yes.
I think over there and over there. But
Please, go ahead.
sorry, I
Yeah,
did.
please do. Go
So
on.
isn't that recent? Or some, I mean, from what I've been reading, from what I've been doing a lot of reading of, you know, narrative nonfiction, memoirs about this time period, and look like after World War II, it seems that there was the Germans still had, and I'm not an expert historian on the area, but the Germans had a extermination plan for the Jews prior to the ultimate solution, the final solution, which was the concentration camps. And so, like, what you're talking about in your book is one of those examples, horrific, obviously. Can you put that in the context of what they were doing overall? And isn't that really the reason why a lot of these stories pre-extermination camps haven't been told? Because they so much involve the local populace of these various Eastern European countries.
Definitely, the first part of that. Definitely, it's true. You know, as I think, you know, I think most historians, as far as I'm aware, acknowledge that June 1941 is when a systematic genocide of Jewish populations in Europe really began. And it's definitely true. You know, this period now is often referred to as the Holocaust by bullets, because the number people often refer to a number of around 1 million. I don't know if how accurate we can say that is. People were shot, you know, before there was any systematic use of gas chambers and so forth. But so I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, no, it's difficult, obviously it's very complicated and difficult. What about accountability for those who were known to have participated? I don't know if you go into that in your book or if you
I do to a degree. I mean, accountability is in Eastern Europe is complicated by the fact that you know, you know, in the decades following, accountability was going to happen under the Soviet system. There wasn't no accountability. You know, there's a series of you know, I went through a large number of trial transcripts of people who were held accountable, and the people are sometimes to be very skeptical of these documents, but the witness statements given there, you know, by and large, apart from obviously people often not taking responsibility for what they did describe seems accurate. But whether, you know, and as I say, I'm no expert on this, but I think it would be fair to say that a few people were held responsible, maybe in order to, you know, move on the conversation from wider responsibility.
And now we move on
Sorry.
to you, Barry White.
Okay, thank you. The subject of the Counterfeit Countess, the Jewish woman who rescued thousands of Poles during the Holocaust, is Janina Mailberg, a Polish Jewish mathematician. She deserves to be honored among the greatest heroines of World War II, but before this year, her story had never been told. I first learned about her in 1989 when I was given a copy of her unpublished memoir. The story that it told seemed so fantastic to me that I had to question whether it could be true. Janina claimed that she survived the Holocaust in German-occupied Lublin, Poland, under the false identity of the Countess Suchodolska, a Polish Christian aristocrat. She used that to become an official of a Polish relief organization for which she negotiated with Nazi and SS officials in Lublin for measures to aid non-Jewish Poles, the only people her organization was allowed to help. From her memoir, it seems she was stubbornly persistent in her negotiations and improbably successful. For example, Majdanek concentration camp was an SS concentration camp in Lublin. She persuaded the SS there to let her organization deliver massive quantities of food for thousands of prisoners 5 days a week. She even brought in decorated Christmas trees and Easter eggs. She brought these deliveries herself inside Majdanek, even though she knew that the SS were murdering thousands of Jewish men, women, and children in Majdanek's gas chambers and shooting pits. What's more, she used the deliveries as cover to smuggle messages, supplies, weapons to members of the resistance imprisoned in the camp, because she was also an officer in the home army of the Polish underground. Now, I had no way to verify this memoir at the time for a number of reasons. She was dead. She had no living relatives. I don't know Polish. And the memoir was in archives, so I figured another historian would find it and bring its story to light. But that didn't happen, and it really haunted me. And so in 2018, I reached out to a certain eminent Holocaust historian, and Debórah put me in touch with Joanna Sliwa, who is an expert on the Holocaust in Poland. Joanna read the memoir and offered to partner with me in investigating Janina's life. So we did research in 9 countries on 4 continents. And we not only verified the memoir, we found that it didn't do justice to what she accomplished. Just based on wartime records, we documented that she negotiated the release from German captivity of more than 9,700 Poles. How many more survived thanks to her relief and resistance activities is impossible to calculate. So, for example, Oskar Schindler is justly honored for having rescued maybe 1,200 Jews. He was a non-Jew who rescued Jews. Janina was a Jew who rescued non-Jews, and she did it in large part by negotiating face-to-face with Nazis who were mass murderers of Jews. Janina's memoir only covers the wartime years, but we discovered that her life before and after was pretty remarkable too. She was born Pepi Spinner, and at age 22 got a PhD in pre-war Poland. In 1941, she became Countess Janina Suchodolska. At the end of the war, she transformed into Dr. Janina Suchodolska, social worker. She became the deputy director of Poland's National Social Welfare Agency. By the 1960s, she was living in Chicago as Dr. Josephine Janina Spinner Mailberg, a tenured full professor of mathematics at the Illinois Institute of Technology. So our book is a chronological narrative of Janina's life that incorporates the many vivid, riveting scenes in her memoir, the conversations she recorded, and also the very inspiring message that we took from her memoir. She wrote about people who she knew were involved in terrible crimes and yet who took risks to help and even save her. She also wrote very movingly about the terrible choices that the war forced people to make. She came to see that none of us is completely defined by either the best or the worst that we do. So she decided for herself that she would not judge what people did to survive, but simply approached each person as a fellow member of what she called the vast, suffering human family. And if they were suffering, she felt it was her duty to relieve that suffering. She was guided in her actions by a simple mathematical principle. One life has a lesser value than multiple lives, and her own life would have no value if she did not use it to save others. So Joanna and I are very committed to trying to get her story as widely known throughout the world as we can, because we believe that the world needs more stories like Janina's. Thank you.
Were there any Jews that were saved by the Countess?
Not that we know of. Not that we know of. We think that one reason she became so obsessed with trying to get food and medicines into Majdanek was that that was the one place where she had a possibility for helping Jews. By the time she got to Lublin in December 41, all the Jews were locked up in the ghetto, and 3 months later they were deported to Belzec. So she really didn't, and of course she was a Jew in hiding, so she just didn't have much opportunity to do that. It's possible that through some of her, through her position in this relief agency, she did help Jews. But one thing we believe about this memoir, which she wrote not long before she died, she wrote it in the 1960s, is that she was writing it for a Polish audience and to counter a very anti-Semitic narrative of the Holocaust that the Polish regime was propagating at that time. So we can't say for certain, but we don't know that she did.
Other questions? Is your arm raised, sir?
Yes.
Hi, you started by saying that someone presented to you this memoir. How did that happen?
Well, in the late 1980s, I was working for the Justice Department on investigations and prosecutions of Nazi criminals in the U.S., and I was working at that time on concentration camp guards, including a few who had served at Majdanek. So I became really fascinated with Majdanek, how different it was from the other camps, and I gave a conference paper on it at the American Historical Association. And afterwards, this historian I didn't know handed me this carbon copy manuscript. Some of you were old enough to know what that was. He had been given the memoir by Janina's husband, the philosopher Henry Mailberg, who had translated her memoir into English after she died. And he wanted to get it published, and this historian had tried but had not been able to. So he was giving it to some archives but wanted me to take this copy since I was writing about Majdanek, so he thought maybe I could make the story known.
Ma'am, of the people that you did rescue, what were they rescued from? These Poles? They were in prison?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, we've been surprised to find how little is known about the persecution of Poles by the Germans. The Nazis considered the Poles to be subhuman racial enemies, only a little bit better than the Jews. And they subjected them to terrible persecution and mass murder. They murdered Polish intellectuals. They abducted more than 2 million Poles to the Reich, separating them from their families to perform forced labor. They carried out massive ethnic cleansing operations. The German occupation cost the lives of 3 million Jewish Poles and nearly 2 million non-Jewish Poles. And the Germans planned to eliminate 80 to 85% of the Poles once they won the war. So Janina's relief organization was doing orphanages and soup kitchens and clinics and providing shelter for the victims of ethnic cleansing operations. And at Majdanek, one of the first things that the first time we found that she was involved in getting people released, she got more than 4,000 prisoners released from Majdanek. And the first 2,000 of them were Polish peasants, mostly children and elderly, who had been dumped in the camp in an ethnic cleansing operation, were rapidly dying from the conditions there. Yes. This lady here. Yes, you? Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
How did she hide that she was Jewish?
What?
How did she hide that she was Jewish? That's the book?
Well,
She married
she
a count.
got no, she didn't marry a count. Her husband was Jewish. They were living in Lvov, today Lviv, at the start of the war. And then in 1941, the Germans came in. They were about to be forced to go into the ghetto in Lviv. And at the last moment, they were saved by an old family friend of hers, Count Andrzej Skrzynski, a real Polish count. And he said, come with me to Lublin, and I can get you false identity papers, because he was in the resistance. So she had these false papers. And she had had a very unusual upbringing. Her father was a wealthy estate owner, so she had grown up mixing in the society of the local nobility. She could really carry off that role, right? Not her husband, not so much. So he was kind of stowed away in a job that wouldn't draw attention to him. But she was very much out front and totally convincing. We don't think anyone ever suspected that she was a Jew, although the Gestapo definitely suspected her of resistance activities, and she was nearly arrested several times.
You said that they considered, Nazis considered Poles subhuman. What about Ukrainians? Are Ukrainians better than Poles?
Yes, somewhat better than Poles. Somewhat. Some.
I mean, why they wouldn't consider Ukrainians subhuman?
Well, they generally considered the Slavs to be subhuman, but the Poles were at the bottom of that. The Poles and Russians.
I thought Russians were always at the bottom.
Poles and Russians. Yeah, but Hitler really hated the Poles. Yeah,
Oh, really?
yeah.
I thought they hated Russians and Serbs.
He also hated the Serbs. Yes, because of World War I. Yes.
And Russians, they
Yeah.
hated the wars in the soldiers when they were caught by the Germans, the soldiers, the Russians and Serbs hated the wars. In prison or in concentration camps.
Yes, sir.
Let me turn to this gentleman, and you get the last question for a single person, and then we open it.
I understand that she remained in Poland after the war until the 60s, and then she came to the United States?
Not till the 60s. So she was the deputy director of this social welfare agency, for which she managed to get a UN fellowship to tour the United States. And she made contacts here with scholars to get them interested in her husband's work. He was a philosopher of physics. And through that, he got to Canada in 1949. And she thought she was going to be able to get to an international. She was on the executive board of the predecessor of Save the Children. So she thought she would get to Europe and then defect. But suddenly, no, she's fired. Her passport's cut off. Somehow, we don't know, she escaped in 1950 and showed up at the Canadian military mission in Berlin and defected.
So thank you very much. Now I open up the floor for our last 10 minutes to discussion with all three papers for questions that you may have come to having heard the other presentations. So let's do like a bakery. 1, 2,
Yes, I hope so. I mean, I hope that they will be told. They will cease being untold. But yes, I mean, there's a lot of stories out there thanks to the recent efforts, in the past 30 years or so to collect the stories of survivors who were still alive. Unfortunately, there were a lot of stories that were lost. And one thing I know from the men who escaped in Chris's book and that they had in common with Yanina is that, well, some of yours spoke right immediately after the war about what they did during the war, but then after that they didn't really speak about it for decades, and Yanina didn't either. So in the United States, some people didn't even know she was Jewish, right? So it's only because she wrote this memoir that we know her story. And that this memoir survived. It's serendipity to some extent.
Jack, Chris, do you want to have a go at that question, or you?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways these stories can still surface up. One way, which I realized researching my book, was that there was a tremendous amount that is in the archives of museums that hasn't really been noticed. Things were not logged right, or just no one had really seen what they were to do with the subject I was writing about. So I think there's been an incredible, I think that so much work has been done to collect so much that, in the most simple level, I don't think people have gone through. People are going to be able to find things for a long time. Does that?
I mean, there's a lot out there, and there's also a lot of work that's being done too. Unfortunately, I can speak as an academic. Usually, our work doesn't get that much notice. But for example, Joanna, my co-author now, she's putting together a whole volume about the experiences of the elderly in ghettos and during the Holocaust. And this is an untold story, really, but a lot of really interesting work is being done on it now.
I think just to add, and maybe this was your experience, Barry, also in researching in Central and Eastern Europe, but I was really struck in my research just how many of the families I spoke to, principally in Poland, didn't know their own families' stories because of the effect of the communist regimes they labored under. It was the case that the Pilecki, the man I wrote about for my last book, because he was a resistance fighter against the Nazis, he was someone who was very quickly targeted by the Soviets as a potential, enemy of the regime, which he was. But, and so many of his colleagues who fought against the Nazis in Auschwitz to describe what was happening in the camp were all arrested. And I just remember very vividly the son of one of Pilecki's very close collaborators who brought his first message out of the camp, and he had no idea that it was his father had worked with Pilecki. It was me, someone new to the story, telling him, and I had the documents and I showed him, and that really just spoke to me for how buried this history is, and how many more stories there are still to come.
Yeah, and yeah, sorry.
The clock is ticking.
Okay.
Is it something that you need to say?
No.
Okay. Please, ma'am, and thank you so very much for your patience.
For holding off.
Yes.
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say this was the most illuminating and exciting thing I've heard in years. So I'm a university professor, and my students do not know what Auschwitz is. They never heard of the final solution. I teach film theory or whatever. Oh yeah, in a state that's required Holocaust education. I was interested in women and children in France. This is my topic. And I did a lot of research, and I came up with a conference that Columbia, thanks to Aaron Warner, who's the head of the seminars, agreed to sponsor. And my university suspended me in the middle of the semester to prevent this conference from going on. It went on, and it's continuing, but it has to navigate, because the forces of resistance are very subtle, especially now on university campuses. So I'm wondering, how did you get the kind of visibility that allowed you, for example, I have a course where I show Hotel Terminus, which is about the Klaus Barbie trial, and I found out that two mothers of the children of Vizieux were responsible for bringing him back. All these other stories that are well known to French audiences and ignored by American audiences. They go, oh, France, but that was around. Okay, so the question is, did you have a structure that allowed you to avoid resistance to your work?
I have not encountered resistance to my work. So, and we just on Tuesday did a seminar with school teachers in New Jersey, and it's a wonderful program where they're training teachers. These teachers are volunteering for it and spending long time learning about the Holocaust so that they can teach it at all different grade levels. And so, I really have not encountered
that program. I'm saying there are subtle forms of resistance, so of course I'm familiar with that.
Jack, Chris, do you?
I don't know that I'm, I don't know that it doesn't exist, but I don't know that I'm aware of anything. Maybe that's all I could say.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that, but your comment underlies, of course, Barry and Chris and mine's work, that the need for it and the need to keep on sharing stories. I haven't encountered resistance.
So Sarah,
Last question. Looking back after all these years, what do you think the message is? What can we learn during these very troubled times from all these individuals and all these times that we can walk out of here with some kind of message for the future, or help us live through what's happening or about to happen?
Well, I think it's so important that we're telling the stories of these individuals and that more and more of these stories get told, because for so long, as I mentioned, Holocaust survivors didn't talk about what happened to them. Some it was too traumatic, some just thought the world didn't care. And that ignorance of their experience led to a lot of misconceptions about the Holocaust, that the Jews, particularly, that the Jews were passive, they went like sheep to the slaughter. In Poland, that they were, not loyal to Poland, that the ones who survived were ungrateful to the Poles who had all tried to, risk their lives to save the Jews and so forth. And these stories really show that that's not true, that that's a lie, that the Jews were passive. They were defiant, they were courageous, they were ingenious, and they were up against something that was utterly impossible in most cases to oppose. But these stories really help us connect to those individuals behind the incomprehensible number of 6 million. So we can see them as people like us. We can identify with them, right? This, in some ways, like the massive numbers, other the victims, and this failure to understand the wider context of Nazi murder as targeting, yes, first and foremost the Jews, but so many other people, makes it, that is another kind of othering of the Jews. We need to see these people as people just like us, and then we can see the danger that we all face when we fail to confront hatred against other groups. That's hatred against us as well. And, what happens when we fail to protect the dignity of every human being. So that is the message that I hope we can get from these stories and take away and try to spread.
Jack, Chris, would you like to add to that?
I think in a more abstract way, anytime we're careful and diligent about telling the truth about things that have happened, that does some good, just in some small way. And cumulatively, to keep doing that is, I think that just in itself is important. And I think one of the difficult lessons in my book is what happens when we use, or when people use history carelessly. And I just think we should be very careful in the way we use history.
Fritz Bauer, towards the end of his life, had appeared on a TV show with a bunch of young kids, and sort of in their 20s, and Bauer had a theory that everyone was capable of redemption, and this really rubbed up some of those young people who were like, how can you say that someone who's killed someone can be capable of any form of redemption? How can you say that of a Nazi murderer? And Bauer really challenged them in that moment to say that for a cultural reckoning that Germany needs, and of course every country needs moments of cultural reckoning, but for Germany, for a cultural reckoning to take place, he insisted that it was possible, even for Nazis, to find some redemption if they could recognize their crimes. Of course, that didn't happen too much, but the point he wanted to bring home to those young kids was, we're not trying to help Nazis find forgiveness or redemption. What we're trying to do is ask questions of ourselves, because we might think ourselves very different to Nazis, but we have to keep examining in ourselves what are the roots of intolerance and bigotry, and furthermore, that act of seeking some form of empathy and understanding with criminals, whether Nazis or not, is going to help us understand each other better. In that world of difference that Bauer faced in post-war Germany, it's quite striking, and in many ways it was controversial, as it was for those young people, to hear Bauer say, someone who had been in a concentration camp, someone who had narrowly escaped the Nazis on many occasions, lost family members. His message to those young people was, we have to try and understand the other, because that helps us ensure that we will be tolerant of each other.